Have you ever sat in silence after failing at something that truly mattered to you? Not angry, not crying, just quiet, as if something inside you had gone still, as if the world kept moving, but you did not. Maybe it happened after a rejection. A door closed, a plan collapsed, a person walked away, or maybe it was one of those private failures that no one ever sees, the kind you carry alone, the kind you replay at night when the room is dark and there is nothing left to distract you. You tell yourself you should be stronger, you tell yourself to move on, but something in you remains there. At that moment, at that wound, at that silent question, why did this happen? Why did I try so hard only to end up here? There is a particular kind of pain and failure that is difficult to explain. It is not only disappointment. It is not only loss. It is the feeling that something in you has been exposed. Your limits, your hope, your effort, your pride, and sometimes your illusion. Failure has a way of stripping the noise away. It leaves you face to face with what you believed life would give you and what it did not. That is why failure feels so heavy, not because the event itself is always enormous, but because it touches something deeper, something older, the fear of not being enough, the fatigue of trying again, the quiet shame of falling when you wanted to stand with dignity. Many people know this pain. Very few speak of it honestly. They speak about success. They speak about confidence. They speak about winning. But failure is usually carried in silence, behind calm faces, behind short answers, behind the words, "I'm fine." And maybe that is why it hurts even more. Because when you fail, you often feel separated from the world, as if everyone else has found a path, and you are the only one left standing in the ruins of your own expectation. But perhaps this is where something important begins. Not comfort, not immediate healing, not some easy lesson wrapped in beautiful words. Something quieter than that. Something more honest, because there are moments in life when failure does not come to destroy you. It comes to interrupt you, to stop the rhythm you were blindly following, to show you what success could never reveal, to place you, for the first time in a long time, in front of yourself. And that meeting is not always gentle. Sometimes it is painful. Sometimes it is humbling. Sometimes it arrives after you have done your best and still lost. That is what makes it so hard to accept. And yet, there is a strange dignity in the person who stays, who does not run from the broken moment, who does not cover it with noise, who sits with the discomfort long enough to hear what failure is trying to say. Not every wound speaks at once. Not every loss reveals its meaning quickly. Some truths only arrive after the pride has gone quiet, after the blame has softened, after the heart has stopped asking why life was unfair and has begun asking what this pain is here to teach. That is where this journey begins, not in victory, not in certainty, but in the quiet aftermath of falling. And in the next part, we begin to look at why failure, painful as it is, may be one of life's most honest teachers. There is something very hard to accept. Most of the wounds we carry in life do not come from accidents. They come from people. A sentence spoken without care, a cold look, a betrayal, a kind of silence that arrives when we need warmth the most. And what hurts us is not only what happened, it is the feeling that we were diminished, misunderstood, treated as if our worth could be touched by someone else's confusion. That pain is real. It should not be denied. It should not be rushed away with forced strength. Because when someone hurts us, the first thing that trembles is not the mind. It is the heart. It is our sense of self. It is the quiet place inside where we long to feel seen without being wounded. But if we stay calm long enough to look a little deeper, something begins to appear. People do not act only from truth. They act from their perception of truth, and perception is often wounded, limited, distorted, clouded by fear, clouded by pride, clouded by pain they have never learned to name. Some people were raised without tenderness, so they do not know how to speak gently. Some have lived too long inside insecurity, so they control, they accuse, they pressure others just to feel stable themselves. Some carry old failures that they have never faced honestly, so they become jealous, dismissive, harsh. They make others feel small because deep down they are afraid of their own smallness. Some people are not deeply cruel. They are simply exhausted, confused, emotionally unformed, full of inner noise. And one day, without even understanding themselves, they pour that noise onto the person standing closest to them, a partner, a friend, a child, a stranger, someone who did not deserve it. This is one of the sad truths of being human. We do not hurt each other only through evil. We also hurt each other through blindness, through inner disorder, through a lack of self-knowledge. And this is where the Stoic spirit becomes quietly important. Because from that view, the actions of other people are first a reflection of their own inner world, their judgments, their habits, their fears, their level of clarity, their level of confusion. What they do comes from how they see, and how they see is often shaped by wounds that existed long before we arrived. This does not make their behavior right. It does not excuse betrayal. It does not make cruelty acceptable. But it changes where we place the meaning. When someone speaks to us with contempt, that contempt reveals something about them before it reveals anything about us. When someone lies, their dishonesty speaks first of their own weakness. When someone abandons us, it does not automatically mean we were not worth staying for. Many of us suffer for years because we confuse treatment with truth. We begin to believe that the way someone handled us must be the measure of who we are, and that is where the wound often goes deepest. A daughter hears from her parents, "You will never become anything." That sentence may live in her for many years, not because it was true, but because it came from the very place where she hoped to be loved. A friend disappears when life becomes difficult, and the pain is not only their absence, it is the question that follows. Did I matter at all? A man is humiliated by his boss in front of others. What keeps him awake at night is not only the insult, it is the feeling that his dignity was placed in someone else's hands. But look again. Parents sometimes speak with hardness, not because their child has no value, but because they never learn how to love without controlling. A friend may fail us not because we are unworthy of loyalty, but because they are weaker than we believed. A superior may insult others, not because others are beneath them, but because power has become their hiding place. This is important to understand. Not so that we become passive, not so that we accept all harm, not so that we smile at injustice and call it wisdom. That is not the point. The point is to see clearly where another person's action begins. It begins in their mind. Their conditioning, their unrest, their ignorance, their unresolved pain, not in our value. Our value does not begin to rise or fall with someone else's anger. It does not collapse because someone else is unfair. It does not vanish because someone fails to see us properly. What they do belongs to their character. What we are belongs to something deeper. And yet, even when we understand this, something in us still aches. We still replay the moment. We still remember the tone. We still carry the sting of words that should have passed but did not. So the question remains, if their actions reflect them more than they reflect us, why do we still hurt? And maybe this is where the deeper pain begins, not in what they did, not even in what they said, but in what their action touched inside us. Because when someone wounds us, they do not only disturb the surface, they reach into places that were already tender, already uncertain, already waiting. That is why two people can face the same rejection and carry it in very different ways. One feels sadness but slowly recovers. The other keeps bleeding inside for months, sometimes years. The event may be similar, but the inner attachment is not. What hurts us most is often not the insult itself. It is the meaning we wrapped around it, the expectation behind it, the silent hope that life would be gentler, that people would be fairer, that love would stay, that loyalty would remain, that effort would be recognized, that sincerity would be returned. And when those hopes are broken, the pain feels larger than the moment itself, because something more than the event has collapsed. An image has collapsed, a picture we carried of how things were supposed to be. This is part of the human condition. We do not simply live. We imagine, we anticipate, we build inner stories around people, outcomes, relationships, futures. And quietly, without noticing it at first, we begin to cling. Not always with desperation, sometimes very softly, very innocently. We cling to being understood, to being respected, to being chosen, to being answered with the same depth we offered to others. And that clinging can feel almost invisible while life is going well. But the moment something breaks, we see how tightly the heart was holding on. That is why pain often says more than we expect it to. Pain reveals attachment. Pain reveals expectation. Pain reveals where we place too much of ourselves into something we could never fully control. A person's opinion, a relationship, a role, a dream, an outcome, even an identity, especially an identity. Because sometimes what hurts us most is not only that someone rejected us, it is that their rejection shook the version of ourselves we wanted to believe in. If they leave, was I not enough? If they criticize me, am I lesser than I thought? If they replace me, was I ever truly valuable? These questions do not come from reason alone. They come from the ancient hunger to be affirmed, to be seen, to be told in one form or another that we matter. And this hunger runs deep, deeper than pride, deeper than vanity. It begins very early in life, long before philosophy, long before wisdom. A child learns to read faces, to notice tone, to search for approval, to feel safe when welcomed and unsafe when dismissed. So when we are hurt as adults, something old often wakes up, not just the present wound, but earlier ones. The feeling of being overlooked, unchosen, misunderstood, not enough. That is why some pain feels larger than the moment deserves, because the moment is not alone. It has company, old memories, old fears, old longings, and all of them rise together. This is why Stoic thought, when understood gently, does not ask us to become stone. It does not ask us to feel nothing. It does not ask us to deny the tremor in the chest, or the heaviness in the throat, or the long silence that comes after being hurt. Emotion is not the enemy. Sorrow is not failure. Disappointment is not weakness. To feel is human. To be shaken is human. To grieve what we hoped for is human. The Stoic path is not about killing feeling. It is about not kneeling before it, not letting pain become a ruler, not letting the first wave decide the whole direction of the soul. Because emotion, when it first arrives, is rarely clear. It is immediate, hot, protective, sometimes frightened. It speaks quickly. It tells us we have been ruined, humiliated, abandoned. It tells us to strike back, to close down, to become colder than before, to build a self that cannot be touched again. And this is the dangerous part. Not that we feel, but that in pain, we are tempted to let feeling become authority. We start mistaking intensity for truth. We assume that because something hurts deeply, our interpretation of it must also be correct. But pain is powerful, not always accurate. It magnifies, it darkens, it narrows the field. It can make one person's failure to love us feel like proof that we are unlovable. It can make one betrayal feel like evidence that trust itself is foolish. It can make one rejection feel like a final verdict on our worth. And in those moments, the mind does not need more force. It needs more space, a little more distance, a little more silence, not to erase the feeling, but to stop living entirely inside it. Because when we remain too close to wounded emotion, we begin to see the whole world through its shape. Everything starts to bend around it. And then suffering deepens, not only because we were hurt, but because we continue to hand the wound more meaning than it deserves. Still, none of this is simple when the heart is tired, when the disappointment is fresh, when the absence is real, when the body remembers what the mind is still trying to understand. That is why this work cannot begin with pressure, only with honesty. To notice where expectation lived, to notice where attachment tightened, to notice how much of our peace was quietly placed in the hands of things that were never stable. And once that becomes visible, something changes. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to begin. Enough to see that the wound is not only asking for comfort, it is also asking for clarity. And perhaps, before anything can truly heal, we must first learn how to sit with pain without letting it lead. When pain enters our life, the first impulse is often the same. We want the other person to change, to explain themselves, to regret what they did, to finally see our value with the clarity they lacked before. This desire is deeply human. It comes naturally, because when something in us has been shaken, the mind begins looking outward. It looks for repair, for justice, for reversal, for one moment that will make everything feel settled again. But life rarely gives peace in that form. And this is where a quieter kind of strength begins to matter. Not the strength that hardens, not the strength that pretends not to care. A steadier strength, the kind that slowly learns where its true ground is. One of the most important shifts is this: to stop asking first, how do I change their mind? And begin asking, what is happening inside me right now? This is not withdrawal, it is not defeat. It is a return to the only place where real influence is possible, the inner life. Imagine a woman who receives a cold message from someone she deeply trusted, just a few brief words, distant, sharp, enough to make her chest tighten, enough to ruin the quiet of her evening. At first, her whole mind turns toward him. Why did he say it like that? What changed? Why this coldness? What did I do wrong? She replays the message again and again, as if repetition might produce peace. But it does not. Because the message is no longer the only source of pain. Now her own mind has joined it. The Stoic response does not begin by denying the sting. It begins by noticing what belongs to the moment and what the mind has added after. The message was brief. The wound became larger through interpretation, through fear, through assumption, through the desperate wish to resolve everything immediately. And so the first practice is gentle, but powerful, to separate the event from the storm around the event, to see what actually happened, and then to see what the imagination is doing with it. This alone can change the weight of suffering, not because it removes pain, but because it keeps pain from multiplying itself in the dark. There is another practice that becomes important here: to let other people remain responsible for their own character. This sounds simple, but in daily life, it is not. A father says something unfair to his son in anger. A friend becomes distant without explanation. A colleague speaks with quiet disrespect in front of others. In these moments, something in us wants to step into their mind, to fix it, to force understanding, to correct their view. But the Stoic spirit moves differently. It remembers that another person's clarity is not ours to command. Their maturity is not ours to manufacture. Their honesty is not ours to pull from them by force of suffering. That does not mean we become passive. It means we stop tying our peace to their transformation. A son may still speak calmly to his father. A friend may still ask one sincere question. A colleague may still be met with quiet dignity and clear boundaries. But inwardly, something changes. The heart stops waiting for another person's perfection before allowing itself to breathe. This is a form of freedom, not dramatic freedom, not loud freedom, a smaller one, but a real one. It is the freedom of no longer placing your inner climate entirely in someone else's weather. Another principle is even more intimate, to protect the space between feeling and action. Because injury creates movement, a quick reply, a harsher tone, a closed face, a long message written at midnight from a place of exhaustion. Many regrets begin here, not in the wound itself, but in the speed of our response to it. Think of a woman who feels dismissed by her sister during a family gathering. The old ache returns at once. She feels unseen. Again, the temptation is immediate, to answer with equal sharpness, to bring old history into the room, to make the pain visible by making the moment heavier. And yet, when even a little space appears, another possibility appears with it. She may still feel hurt. She may still speak later, but she no longer needs to let the first wave decide the tone. That pause is not weakness. It is self-respect. It is the refusal to let another person's confusion recruit your own mind into chaos. This is how inner control often looks. Not grand, not impressive, just a quieter decision made in time. There is also the practice of returning to what remains intact. After being hurt, the mind easily focuses on what was lost. The trust, the warmth, the image of what we thought the bond was. But even in loss, not everything disappears. Character can remain. Clarity can remain. The ability to speak honestly can remain. The capacity to walk away without hatred can remain. A man may realize that a friendship has changed. Perhaps it will never again be what it once was. This is painful. But even there, he still has choices. He can become bitter, or he can become more honest. He can chase what has already faded, or he can carry himself with a little more steadiness into the next season of life. This does not erase grief. It simply reminds him that another person's change of heart does not have to become the collapse of his own center. And maybe this is the quiet heart of Stoic practice. Not controlling people, not forcing outcomes, not demanding that life move in a way that protects us from all hurt, but learning again and again to keep returning inward to the part that can observe, the part that can wait. The part that can choose tone, timing, meaning, direction. That part grows slowly. Through moments, small ones, an unanswered message, an unfair word, a misunderstanding at home, a disappointment in love, a silence where tenderness was hoped for. And each time, if we remain a little present, a little honest, a little less eager to control what was never ours, something soft begins to settle, not because the world has become easy, but because we are no longer asking it to give us peace in the wrong place. And when that understanding deepens, the heart does not become colder. It becomes lighter, less entangled, less desperate, still human, still tender, but no longer as easily carried away. And that is enough for now. Enough to breathe more gently, enough to loosen the grip, enough to feel, even in quiet pain, that something inside has begun to rest. There comes a point in life when winning begins to lose its charm, not because effort no longer matters, not because truth no longer matters, but because the soul becomes tired of fighting battles that leave the inside empty. When we are younger, we often think peace will come after we prove something, after we are understood, after we are respected, after the person who wronged us finally sees what they lost, after the world admits that we were right. There is a certain fire in this, a very human fire. It says, I will not rest until the balance is restored, until the story ends in my favor, until my pain is answered by recognition. But life has a quiet way of teaching otherwise, because even when people do win, they are not always free. They win the argument and lose their sleep. They win the position and lose their gentleness. They win the final word and lose the silence that once made them whole. This is why the Stoic mind does not become obsessed with defeating anyone. It sees something many people miss. Victory over another person and peace within oneself are not the same thing. Sometimes they do not even walk together. You may prove your point and still feel disturbed. You may expose someone's flaws and still carry bitterness for years. You may be declared right in the eyes of others and still be inwardly chained to the moment you wanted to rise above. That is not freedom. It only looks like freedom from a distance. Real freedom is quieter. It does not always appear as triumph. Sometimes it appears as the decision not to continue a struggle that is consuming the heart. There are people who spend years trying to win against someone who has already moved on. A former partner, a parent, a friend, a colleague. They want to be vindicated. They want to be seen clearly. They want the other person to finally feel regret. And beneath all of this is a painful hope. If they understand what they did, perhaps I will finally be released. But inner release rarely comes that way, because the more our peace depends on another person's realization, the more we remain bound to them, even in absence, even in silence, even across great distance. That is the hidden burden of needing to win. It ties the soul to the very thing it wants to rise above. This is why a mature mind begins to ask a different question. Not, how do I make them see? But, why must my peace wait for that? That question changes something. It brings dignity back to the center, because now the struggle is no longer about conquest. It becomes about release. There is a deep difference between overcoming someone and outgrowing the need to overcome them. The first still depends on conflict. The second begins to end it. Imagine a man who was insulted publicly by someone insecure and proud. For months he thinks of the perfect reply, the perfect scene, the moment he will return the same humiliation with greater force. And perhaps one day he could do it. Perhaps he could speak in such a way that the other man falls silent. Perhaps everyone around them would see who was stronger. But what then? Would the heart become lighter? Would the long disturbance disappear? Would all those restless nights suddenly turn into peace? Not always. Because revenge may satisfy the wounded image of the self, but it rarely heals the deeper unrest. It may feed pride, it may calm anger for an hour, but peace asks for something else, something less dramatic, something harder. The willingness to no longer build identity around being the injured one who must one day return the blow. This is not passivity. It is not surrender to injustice. It is not telling yourself that harm was acceptable. It is the quiet recognition that your life is too sacred to be organized around another person's blindness. The Stoic spirit does not refuse strength. It simply places strength in a different place, not in domination, not in emotional conquest, not in the pleasure of standing above someone else, but in self-command, in proportion, in the ability to remain inwardly unruined even when the outer world has offered plenty of reasons to become hard. There is a kind of person who always needs to win the room, to win the disagreement, to win the image, to win the memory. And often, beneath that habit, there is fear, the fear of being small, the fear of being forgotten, the fear that if they do not dominate, they will disappear. But the one who has touched a deeper stillness begins to see something gentler. You do not become greater by standing over another. You become greater when you are no longer reduced by their weakness. You do not become free by making them lose. You become free when their confusion no longer dictates the climate of your inner world. This is why peace of mind is a very different kind of victory. It does not need an audience. It does not require applause. It does not need a witness to confirm that it happened. Sometimes it is invisible. A person walks away from a conversation they once would have prolonged. A woman stops rewriting the same message in her head and lets the evening return to silence. Someone releases the need to explain themselves to a person committed to misunderstanding them. These moments are small in the eyes of the world, but inwardly they are immense, because each one says the same thing. My life will not be ruled by this anymore. And from there, something spacious begins. The mind softens. The chest loosens. The old urgency weakens, not because nothing mattered, but because not everything must be fought to the end. Some doors do not need to be closed with force. Some distances do not need to be explained. Some people do not need to be defeated. They only need to be left where they are while you continue walking. That is where inner freedom begins to feel real, not as an idea, as a lived relief, a loosening, a return to your own breath, to your own step, to the quiet realization that peace was never hidden inside another person's surrender. It was waiting on the other side of your need to win. And perhaps maturity is just this: to stop standing at the edge of old battles, listening for your name, to stop asking the night to bring justice in the form of someone else's defeat, to gather yourself gently, to turn without bitterness, to walk on with less weight in the heart, like someone leaving a long road at dusk, the dust settling behind them, the light thinning softly ahead. And somewhere in that fading distance, without anger, without noise, without one last attempt to be seen, they keep walking toward a quieter horizon. And so, in the end, perhaps nothing dramatic changes. The world remains the world. People still misunderstand. Some stay, some leave. Some speak with care, some do not. And life, in its own quiet way, keeps unfolding without asking whether we feel ready. But something in us can become different. Not louder, not harder, not untouchable, just quieter, more settled, like water after the wind has passed. There is a kind of peace that does not come from having the perfect life. It does not come from being praised or protected or always understood. It comes more slowly than that, more quietly. It comes when a person has looked at pain without turning away, when they have stood in the middle of disappointment without letting it define the whole meaning of their life, when they have learned that not every wound must become a story they keep telling forever. Some things happen, they hurt, they leave a mark, and still, they do not have to become the center of who we are. This is part of the stillness the Stoic spirit seems to carry. Not the stillness of coldness, not the stillness of someone who no longer feels. A warmer stillness, a deeper one. The stillness of someone who has made peace with the fact that life will not obey them, that others will not always love well, That effort will not always be rewarded in the form we hoped for, that the heart will sometimes be asked to endure what it never would have chosen. And yet, something remains, something inward, a small place that can stay honest, a small place that can stay awake, a small place that does not collapse every time the outer world changes its face. Maybe that is why this way of seeing life feels so quiet. It does not promise that sorrow will vanish. It does not promise that loss will suddenly become easy. It does not promise that the mind will never again grow restless in the dark. It only offers a different way of standing, a different way of caring, a different way of remaining human without becoming ruled by every passing wound. There is something very humble in that, and very beautiful, because so much of human suffering comes from struggle, from resistance, from the endless demand that life should have been otherwise, that people should have known better, that the past should have been kinder, that the world should have paused before touching what was fragile in us. But it did not, and perhaps wisdom begins when that argument starts to grow quiet. Not because everything was fair, not because nothing mattered, but because the soul grows tired of fighting reality long after the moment has passed. Then a softer strength appears, not the strength of force, the strength of release, the strength of not adding more noise to what is already painful, the strength of seeing clearly what belongs to life and what belongs to our own insistence. A person loses something. Someone they loved, someone they trusted, a version of the future they once held close. For a while, the heart resists. It asks, it replays, it reaches backward. This is natural. This is human. But slowly, if there is enough honesty, something begins to loosen. Not all at once, not in one brave moment. Just little by little, the hand unclenches, the breath deepens, the mind stops returning to the same closed door as if longing alone could open it. And then life feels different, not brighter exactly, not easier, but less entangled, less desperate. There is more room around each thought, more air inside each moment. Even grief changes there. It becomes quieter, more spacious, less like drowning, more like carrying rain through a long field at dusk. This is not victory in the usual sense. No one sees it. No one applauds. There is no final scene where the world explains itself. There's only a person becoming a little more whole in private, a little less reactive, a little less afraid of what they cannot hold, a little less dependent on being confirmed by things that change. And maybe that is enough. Maybe a life does not need to become invincible. Maybe it only needs to become inwardly honest, to know where peace begins, to know where illusion begins, to know the difference between what can be guided and what must be endured. There is a quiet dignity in that kind of life. A person wakes. They carry what they carry. They speak when needed. They remain silent when silence is wiser. They do not rush to defeat every insult. They do not chase every explanation. They do not hand their inner weather to every passing storm. And so they move differently, not above life, not outside pain, but through it with a steadier step, with less argument, with less fear, with less need to turn every wound into bitterness. At some point, the mind stops asking for a life without difficulty and begins to ask for a heart that can remain clear inside difficulty. That shift is small, almost invisible, but once it happens, something essential changes. The world is still uncertain. People are still imperfect. Loss still arrives. Even so, the soul no longer trembles in quite the same way, because it has learned that peace was never found in controlling the whole road, only in how one walks it. And perhaps that is all this quiet path was ever trying to say. that a human life does not become meaningful by avoiding pain. It becomes meaningful by learning how to meet pain without losing the deepest part of oneself. Then the night feels different, still dark, still vast, but not empty. And the silence is no longer a burden. It becomes a place where something gentle remains, something watchful, something unbroken. And when all the noise is gone, that may be the only thing that matters, to leave this life with a quieter heart and a soul that did not become cruel.